Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Kearns, and I'm the Restoration Partnerships Coordinator for the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration in the Department of Fish and Game. Welcome to the Dam Busters 201 series, a collaboration between our agency, the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance, and the Charles River Watershed Association. This webinar offers basic information about dam removal to managers from municipalities and nonprofits that may be considering such projects in the future. Please note that this series is not intended to advocate for the removal of any particular dam or dams. For the 201 series topics and exact schedule, please visit the Mass Rivers Alliance website at www.massriversalliance.org. We are still adding sessions to the series, so we recommend that you check the site frequently for the latest information. You can also find all the information and recordings for the last year's webinar series, the Dam Busters 101 series on the Mass Rivers Alliance website. Today's webinar is about stream restoration and stream channel design. Please mark your calendars for the next webinar, which is on March 12th at noon. We'll be talking about building the dam removal management team. Note that March 12th is the second Wednesday of that month, not the first Wednesday, which we usually meet for the Dam Buster series. And before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. Number one, this session is scheduled to end at 1 p.m. Number two, please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which folks from Mass Rivers and myself will be tracking, and we will hold them for our Q&A session with John after his presentation. Also, please put your name and affiliation in the chat. And these webinars are being recorded. So being on here, just be aware of that. And recordings and other webinar materials will be made available on the Mass Rivers Alliance website. Lastly, we would like to thank you all for coming here today, and also remind you to please complete the evaluation survey. It definitely helps out Mass Rivers Alliance and the whole Dam Busters team improve these webinar series. Survey has been crucial in helping us to, expand the series and make it better. We're also asking folks to send us experience with dam removal permitting to Mass Rivers Alliance for their work on that issue. We will put the links to these surveys in the chat, as well as send to you all via email after the webinar. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, John Field of Field Geology Services. I'll just read a little intro on John. Dr. Field received a PhD in 1994 from the University of Arizona with concentrations in fluvial geomorphology and hydrology. During his 8 years as a university professor, he received 2 teaching awards and was active in training teachers and government agency personnel on techniques for assessing the stability and habitat condition of streams. During more than 20 years of consulting, Dr. Field has completed geomorphic assessments on hundreds of miles of rivers and streams around the world, including several dam removal projects, to identify the need and best approach for restoration. The assessments have ultimately led to the design, permitting, and invitation of more than 30 miles of restoration and bank stabilization projects. With that, I will pass it off to John for his presentation. Welcome, John.
Thank you. All right, hold on there.
No problem. Take your time.
Back to Zoom. Hold on. There's the share button.
Yeah, it should be on the bottom.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, great. It's always fun to share screen.
Yeah. You can see that now?
Yeah, just want to put it in. Yep, beautiful. See the
Good.
slides. Awesome.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. John Field. I am a fluvial geomorphologist, which I understand many of you at last week's presentation with Dr. Noah Snyder are perhaps familiar with fluvial geomorphology now, or river geology for those that are unfamiliar. Uh, a little disclaimer here. I was supposed to speak about stream restoration. I'm going to change that up a little bit. I do think of dam removals as stream restoration, so I think I'm safe. But as we normally envision stream restoration, I'll touch on briefly. But I will focus on using fluvial geomorphology as part of dam removal projects. You already heard of bio, but uh, worked in several countries and states. And for those that have heard me speak before, you've perhaps heard two adages or pithy statements I like to use to help understand river processes. First of these is rivers don't like fast changes. The second is flowing water carries sediment. Even a small trickle of water across a road is capable of moving sediment. In rivers, there's far more sediment in movement, but but we're always sort of focused on the water. We see the water flowing down the river. We often forget about the sediment. But I sort of use this statement just to keep that at the forefront of our minds because sediment is such a huge a part of fluvial geomorphology, but also in managing dam removal projects. Let me sort of illustrate what I mean by rivers don't like fast changes. When we look at a longitudinal profile of a stream, looking at the headwaters, the high elevation, all the way down to the mouth of the river, low elevation areas, rivers ultimately like to establish a smooth concave up profile where there's a minimum amount of slope change at any one point. If you have a river system with steep, sharp drops where all the elevation change is occurring at one or a few points, this would be an unstable configuration, and the river is working towards creating that smooth equilibrium grade line, I will call it. Now, that doesn't mean we don't see sharp drops on rivers. Niagara Falls is a good example of that. Perfectly natural, but what you don't appreciate is the river is slowly trying to eliminate that change very, very slowly. In the case of the bedrock Niagara Falls, it's hard to appreciate that change in the span of our lifetimes, but over thousands of years, the river is slowly moving to eliminate that waterfall. Now let's turn our attention to dams. I'll start in Pennsylvania's Solebury Township. Ponacussing Creek had 5 dams. I'm depicting 3 here. But where you have a dam, you, of course, many know, you impound water upstream, you create a pond. Flowing water carries sediment, but ponded water does not. So upstream of these dams, we slowly accumulate sediment behind these dams. Now, in the case of Ponacussing Creek, these dams slowly fell apart over time. Some might have even washed out during a large flood. But when those dams disappeared, the impoundment sediments did not, and we were left with a stepped profile, which is unstable. The river's trying to establish an equilibrium grade line with a minimal amount of slope change at any point. So once the dams were gone, the impoundment sediments began to erode, and so the sort of bottom of the mill pond is way up here, But as those impoundment sediments erode, we have sort of eroding banks as the channel reestablishes its grade. That can be a potential problem where you have infrastructure crossing the stream, as here on Ponacussing Creek, a gas pipeline is crossing, and that pipeline is being undermined. This is immediately upstream of one of those old dams, and that impoundment sediment incision might be continuing, creating a conflict with the infrastructure. We have similar things going on in Massachusetts. South River in Conway, Massachusetts. There was many dams in Conway back in the day. The only evidence that remains of some of these dams is the old map we found in the Historical Society. And also there's evidence in the form of impoundment sediments which are eroding behind those old dams. Now, there's no infrastructure buried across the river that I'm aware of that's threatened by this incision, but all of this fine-grained impoundment sediment is moving downstream towards the impaired Connecticut River, and so there is potential issues with this erosion. Now, these are, if you will, sort of natural dam removals, the sort of power of time, if you will. But now let's turn our attention to actual purposeful dam removals. I'll start where Noah focused last week, which is the Merrimack Village dam removal. And as he described, there was some rapid incision and then some subsequent widening and continued incision of the impoundment sediments upstream of the dam. Over time now, there's been more than 10 feet of incision in places. Please note the scale is in meters. But where does all that sediment go? It's moving downstream, and immediately downstream of the Merrimack Village Dam, there was huge waves of sediment, large sandbars developing, which subsequently eroded itself and continued downstream to the Merrimack River. The Merrimack River was only less than a half a mile downstream. This was studied carefully. It was thought out. What should we do with the sediment that's going to be released? And finally, they decided to do nothing. That they were not concerned about the sediment moving into the much larger Merrimack River, which could easily accommodate this influx from the smaller Sauhegan River, as dramatic as that sediment movement was. But but that does need to be a concern when you're looking at a dam removal. What is the fate of that sediment if there is sediment in the impoundment? Where will that sediment end up, and could it create a problem? Well, let's look at our adage, look for the fast changes, or rivers don't like fast changes. That's what you're looking for. When I'm involved in a dam removal assessment, I'm looking for places that sediment might accumulate. Once we've identified those places, then we consider, is there potential impacts to infrastructure or sort of high quality habitat? So the things you're looking for are valley constrictions downstream. Most of these are not, or all these are not related to dam removals. I'm just trying to illustrate the types of things you're looking for. And I'm showing dramatic examples. Here on the Ammonoosuc River, there's a valley constriction at downstream. During a flood, this water will be impounded upstream of the constriction, and lots of sediment is accumulating upstream of here already. A dam removal, if there was one upstream, would only exacerbate that situation. On a smaller scale, we can look for channel constrictions. This would typically take the form of an undersized crossing, where the crossing is narrowing the river channel. So we're also, during even smaller events, impounding flow, much like a dam, and depositing sediment. Tributary confluences are a typical place to find sediment accumulating. not only the sediment building out from the tributary itself, but this tributary and the sediment building out is creating kind of a constriction, and we can deposit sediment upstream of the tributary. If you had a dam removal upstream, you'd be looking for these tributaries and the potential for excess sediment to accumulate. Finally, you want to look for sharp bends. Sometimes these sharp bends are artificial because of past channel straightening. Here we actually do have a dam in the picture. This is the Canaan Dam in far northern Vermont and New Hampshire. This was a recently relicensed hydropower facility, and so any thought of dam removal is decades away. But just to illustrate, if this dam was to be removed and there was sediment behind it, I would expect that sediment to be accumulating at this sharp bend, perhaps exacerbating erosion into agricultural fields. Again, sometimes we might be all right with that sediment accumulating. Sometimes that sediment accumulation might, in fact, improve habitat, but it is something you need to be focused on in a dam removal project. What is that fate of sediment moving downstream? If you decide that a sediment release is not possible because of this downstream sediment accumulation or other reasons, there are other options. You can do a stream restoration project or a natural channel design project where you actually excavate the impoundment sediment and create a channel that you would expect to develop over time, thereby sort of not allowing that sediment to move downstream where you've perhaps decided there's potential problems. So this would sort of create that channel. The river is ultimately going to create on its own, if you will. I'm not familiar with a natural channel design project upstream of a dam in New England. That doesn't mean there hasn't been any, but I've pulled an example from actually a very good document that Minnesota DNR has put out, so maybe worth a look. But those that have heard me talk before are probably aware I'm not a big fan of natural channel design. These are extremely expensive projects. Uh, and after you spend all that money, there's typically an urge to sort of lock the channel in place. We spent all this money, we don't want this channel moving around. But that's the whole point in stream restoration. Rivers, to maintain geomorphic equilibrium or geomorphic stability, need to move. They need to be able to migrate. So a true natural channel design project should not be armored. And if you're doing it upstream of the dam, not only do you need to excavate the channel, you might also need to excavate a wide enough floodplain, at least 6 times the channel width, in order to give the room for the stream to migrate over time and maintain its stability. Well, now that project has become even more expensive if we're excavating even more material. So anyway, especially the smaller dam removal projects in New England, really isn't an option just given the expense. So other possibilities for managing the sediment if you don't want a big release of sediment downstream is to build rock ramps or rock weirs. These are basically freezing that drop. The dam has been removed, or at least partially removed in these examples, but for whatever reason, we don't want the water level to drop. In fact, in these examples, it wasn't really about sediment release. The example in the left from Rhode Island was about maintaining wetlands. They are sort of artificially created wetlands to some extent because the dam has impounded a higher water level for centuries. But the wetland complexes are high quality now, and so Department of Environmental Management, as well as recreational boaters, didn't really want to see the water level drop. despite the dilapidated dam and the hazard and the risk, the decision was made to go with the rock ramp. The rock weirs here in the West Swansea, New Hampshire, the dam was immediately downstream of this covered bridge. So the thought was the potential scour. I don't think there was really sediment to incise, but the sort of increased slope through here, if they just removed the dam, might have potentially created scour problems at the bridge. So decision made to make weirs so there wasn't that sort of elevation drop all of a sudden. Now let's look at another scenario where the sediment isn't necessarily accumulating right at the upstream face of the dam. Here's an example from Temple Stream in Farmington, Maine that I worked on. Here the impoundment was quite long. It's almost a mile long to the upstream end of the impoundment near my flow symbol here. And so when looking at a sort of bathymetric profile of the below the impoundment water surface before the dam was removed, you could see that the impoundment sediment was actually accumulating at the upstream end of the impoundment. This is perhaps typical of long impoundments. The sediment is accumulating at the upstream end of the impoundment, not at the dam face, as was the case at the Merrimack Village Dam described earlier. So looking at this profile, I immediately sort of noticed this sharp break, and that sort of clued me in. This is sort of the front of the impoundment sediments. This is the fast change in the profile we might need to be concerned about with dam removal. Again, I'm envisioning what the equilibrium grade line might be here after removal. In fact, we might see some sediment deposition in the pools, but most of the significant deposition in the past and the significant sort of erosion and incision would be at the upper end of the impoundment when the dam was removed. Now, adding to the complexity here, this dam had been around for centuries, at least one. And so much later, the town of Farmington basically built a pipeline through the impoundment sediments. And so there was concern that with the incision and establishment of a grade line, that pipe water line would become compromised. So the town managed to find a workaround to service just a few homes that were being served by this pipe. They were able to close down the pipe. And with the dam removal, my understanding is that pipe did become exposed. And so it's a good thing that the study was done and the understanding that it could be a potential problem was identified beforehand rather than sort of having a problem after the removal. When the dam was removed, immediately we saw sand waves moving through the impoundment area. And basically, this is attenuating the sediment that's moving downstream. It's not a sudden burst of sediment right at the face of the dam. It's actually spreading itself out over time. So there's not this huge initial wave of sediment. It's coming very slowly as it passes through the entire impoundment area before passing below the dam. This turned out to be an important issue to address because there were identified Atlantic salmon redds. For those that don't know, those would be the nests where salmon lay their eggs on the stream bottom. There was a concern that the dam would, when removed, would basically bury these salmon redds in sediment. My assessment was is that sediment would spread out slowly, and it was decided that would not be an issue for the reds, and as I understand, has not been an issue. But meanwhile, we've opened up with dam removal several miles more of potential habitat. This was an Atlantic Salmon Federation operated project. Just another little aside, a restoration piece as part of this project. We also built a large log jam, not only to protect remaining infrastructure that's part of a town park, but also to divert water back towards the center of the channel where it was deeper and where the salmon were expected to sort of pass through the dam area. Now let's look at another scenario, the typical run-of-the-river dam. I know Noah mentioned last week that this is maybe the rule rather than the exception in New England, where in fact we have no sediment accumulating behind the dam. The sort of hydrodynamics of flow in these settings actually allows the water to, or the not only the water, but the sediment to also pass over the dams. So when we removed this dam, there was actually no sediment accumulated behind it. The dam was all, or the river was already in its sort of pre-dam graded condition, and so there was no sediment to manage. That unfortunately does not mean there's no potential problems to deal with. If you have a sharp drop in these deeper impoundments, if you drop the water level quickly with a dam removal, you can potentially have water seeping out of the banks, creating an erosion problems. This is the Temple Stream example I just gave you. This is down closer to the dam. There is erosion occurring. This could be a seepage erosion issue. This is not incision through impoundment sediments. This channel was here, was not filled in by the dam. So this erosion is potentially a seepage erosion problem. There's no infrastructure here. It's not really a concern. Other places, though, that could be a concern, as was the case at the Fort Halifax Dam on the Sebasticook River. Immediately upstream of the dam and immediately following dam removal, there was a large landslide at the edge of a cemetery in the town of Winslow. The town was linking it to the dam removal. The dam owners were linking it to heavy rains and a small earthquake that occurred about the same time. So it's really a hard one to unravel, but it's something you need to be thinking about and concerned with. This was, you can see in the headline, was sort of legal wranglings for a couple of years before essentially Winslow gave up the fight when the DEP basically said we can't hold the owners liable for the erosion. But this is my take on it. It probably was seepage erosion. It's just that timing, the proximity in time and space was just suspicious, I'll say. I wasn't really involved in the legal wranglings. But in my mind, that opened my eyes to being concerned about this seepage erosion. So I'm currently involved in Potter Hill Dam removal in Rhode Island. With full removal here, there would be a 7-foot drop in water level. Here we have a road right along the edge of the riverbanks. If you have infrastructure close to the impoundment, even if there's not sediment accumulating in the impoundment, that sharp water level drop could cause a seepage erosion problem. Sort of geotechnical studies are really needed to sort of fully assess whether it could or couldn't happen beforehand. But just that concern, just be aware of it and think about it. It's something we need to be concerned about. In the end here, because of various political machinations and the property owner interest, etc., this will ultimately end up being only a partial removal, probably a couple foot drop at the most. And so that's not enough of a drop to really create those seepage forces that might cause erosion. Now, let me end with a sort of brief, or maybe slightly more than brief, note on hydraulic modeling. A lot of these dam removal projects involve hydraulic modeling. Those of you that are not hydraulic modelers or engineers or geomorphologists perhaps have seen hydraulic modeling results, but really it doesn't mean anything to you. You don't know how to analyze it. Let me give you an example of how you might sort of look at hydraulic model results because they are such an important part of these dam removal projects. I'm going to start you halfway around the world in the Kingdom of Bhutan. Not really a dam removal project, but just a way to look at hydraulic modeling results. When I was in Bhutan, I only saw the high Himalayas from an airplane because I was at the downstream end of the long canyons, working at where these rivers open up onto the great Indian plains in the southern part of the country. In one of these canyons opening up, there's a huge braid plain. As the water spreads out, it deposits its sediment. You have a mile wide sort of river system here. As you can see in the background, Bhutan's a very steep country, very little land to develop. So the project idea here was to basically narrow the channel down to about 1,000 feet wide, pretty big river for New England still, and basically fill in the rest of the area and develop homes and businesses, etc., on this filled ground. They're also building 3 bridges to cross to the other side of the development. Now looking at the hydraulic modeling results. This is a velocity profile, not an elevation profile. So this is velocity, the speed of the flow on the left here, and the distances upstream end here, downstream end to the left. The design engineers of this project were very proud of themselves because they were able to maintain a constant velocity through the channel, so they thought. And that constant velocity sort of translate into maintaining sediment transport. They could keep the sediment moving through this design channel without accumulating. My eyes immediately are drawn to the fast changes. Basically, an extreme drop in velocity when you first enter the project, where they first neck down the channel, and then at each of the bridges, which are also places where the channel is being narrowed, constriction. So we're getting some backwatering or a velocity drop. These little tiny drops in the whole scope of the project are absolutely critical. Look for the fast changes. This means all of that sediment and transport is going to drop out. Fast moving water carries a lot of sediment. Slower moving water carries less sediment. So there's going to be large amounts of sediment being deposited here, infilling the channel, potentially causing an overtopping of their developed fill surface, with potentially devastating consequences. In the end, they've sort of modified the project. Still not a great thing, but they're not building the bridges and developing the other side, at least for now. Now let's take that idea of hydraulic modeling to an example in Massachusetts. I might get myself in trouble here now because some of you might have been working on this project, but this was a dam removal that occurred in 2010. Keep in mind the flood of record, I believe, for this river was Tropical Storm Irene 1 year later in 2011. With the dam removal, they did do a sort of natural channel design project. They excavated a channel through the impoundment sediments. They did create a small floodplain to sort of dissipate some of the floodwaters. As part of the dam removal, a small piece of that dam was left in place. Enough of the dam was removed for sort of aquatic organism passage, but it might turn out that that small piece of dam did not allow for large flood passage. And so with the Tropical Storm Irene, a huge gravel bar formed upstream, right basically where the dam was, upstream of it, and the constructed channel was basically infilled water diverted and basically unravel the constructed floodplain and started to eat away and erode into a bank, which is cutting through a yard and getting uncomfortably close to a condo complex, at least uncomfortably close for the residents. Lots of problems at Briggsville, lots of questions at Briggsville. A hydraulic model would help answer some of these questions. The Highway 8 washed out just upstream. Was the dam removal in any way linked to that? A hydraulic model would help answer that questions. Did velocities increase with the dam removal in this area? Don't know yet. This eroding fill, this was artificial fill, is this eroding bank here? Could we, excuse me, could we remove that fill and create a little bit of floodplain space? Surprisingly, the condo owners are actually sort of warm to the idea. I thought they would reject it out of hand. Uh, Downstream, even further, is an armored berm. Could that berm be removed and provide some more flood relief? The whole mill complex is potentially constricting flow. The whole mill complex is probably built on artificial floodplain fill, further constricting flow. All of this flow constriction is ending at a sharp bend where we have a huge landslide. If that landslide, which was reactivated during Irene, could that dam up the water and create a backwatering which resulted in deposition upstream? Don't know. A hydraulic model could help answer these questions. If in fact a hydraulic model has been now funded, probably will be completed this summer to help address some of these questions. That's a lot only at one site. I've covered a lot through the talk today. I just encourage you to keep these two adages in mind as you begin a new dam removal assessment, as you consider funding a dam removal, as you consider permitting a dam removal project. Keep these adages in mind because these are the points that you want to focus on. Look for those fast changes. Don't forget flowing water is carrying sediment. And if you keep those in mind, you might be able to answer the critical questions that will improve your project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Fantastic presentation. We're getting a lot of questions coming in Q&A in the chat, so we will start off there. I have one question though. I want to start off with. You touched this on your slides, John, but also Noah talked about it too. Last session, there was a lot of discussion in the chat um, about how New England rivers, compared to like West Coast rivers, have less sediment moving for dam removals and just in general. Can you talk a little bit about this? The difference between East Coast versus West Coast New England?
Right. Well, Noah, I sort of watched his presentation getting ready for this one. He hinted at the sort of sediment supply that we're not the steep mountains of the western U.S. That's part of it. I think a bigger part of it is this run of the river aspect of many of the dams in New England. That the dynamics of flow, as I showed in that one small sketch, is such that at run of the river dams, the sediment can actually move up and over these dams without accumulating behind the dams. And I think that's another part of it as well.
Thank you. I really like that image. That was really helpful. There's one question in the chat earlier about the example where the pipeline was in the impoundment upstream, and they're asking if those were concrete reticulated blocks that were ripped up when that that image there. There was a question about that. I don't know if you know.
Oh, the gas pipeline. Yes,
Yes.
those were concrete articulated mats, I guess they call
Okay.
them. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Next question we have for somebody in the Q&A is, what do you need to keep in mind for such projects for extreme weather events, especially with climate change?
Well, that Briggsville Dam is a good example because that was an extreme event. Maybe they're even going to get worse with climate change, but Tropical Storm Irene was basically the largest on record in many watersheds throughout the region. Uh, and again, I don't know yet till we get the hydraulic modeling results. That was just a small piece of that dam remnant was left, but was that enough to constrict the flow to sort of back up the water? I don't know why. Well, that artificial fill at the upstream end, the dam was removed basically even with the artificial fill, but at the downstream end, you can sort of see where that dam remnant is sort of jutting out from the original channel. So the question is, um, when you're removing a dam, think about the hydraulics and the hydraulic flow and flood flow. Uh, Most of these dam removals are related to aquatic organism passage. You only need to remove a piece of the dam to get the passage, but if you're leaving a portion of the dam constricting the flow, you're going to have problems during the large flood flows and all that sediment dropping out, as happened at Briggsville. I'm not quite sure yet what was causing the constrictive nature of flow at the dam. I have a suspicion about the dam, but I also pointed out a lot of other things going on. So let's wait for the hydraulic modeling results before we know for sure.
Thanks. This question kind of goes uh, good segue from Paul asks, does the HEC-RAS sediment transport models help, and how does that relate to bridge scour?
I'm not a hydraulic modeler, but I will say I'm still not convinced that hydraulic models, even those that are now including sediment transport, are really that reliable or accurate. So I would continue to take with a grain of salt any hydraulic modeling results portending to speak to sediment transport. And I know some hydraulic modelers I respect that would echo the same thing I just said. So be extremely careful looking at hydraulic modeling results for sediment management. Again, the qualitative assessments I do, just looking for those fast changes, looking where velocities are dropping or water surfaces are changing rapidly. That's going to tell you where the sediment's dropping out. And I don't believe the models can quantify that either. So we're still left with sort of the qualitative assessments.
Thank you. Okay, we got another question. As project managers, should we include geomorpholic or geomorphic engineering services after removal to monitor changes in the river?
Well, short answer is yes. Going to help you in future projects. Going to help you identify potential problems early if there are any. Um, and I've been involved in sort of monitoring after dam removals. Uh, so how is the channel changing? Sort of NOAA's sort of 10, 15-year study behind the Merrimack Village Dam gives us lots of great information about how quickly this is going to happen, the incision compared to the widening. All that's useful information for future projects, even if it's not at the same location. Um, Funding agencies, maybe it's changing, but typically they want to spend the money on the sexy thing, which is removing the dam. They don't want to spend money on studies after, but hopefully that's changing.
Thank you. All right, next question is you kind of touched on this on the slides, but instead of armoring to rechannelize a river and stream, would it be better to use tools like log jams to direct the flow to the center of the water body? You kind of mentioned this, but I don't know if you want to expand on it.
Yeah, that one example from Minnesota I gave, they were uh, sort of armoring the bank with wood. They were using log jams. That's going to be better for habitat. They were sort of placing those at the outside of bends, so they're at least in the short term, sort of trying to prevent that movement of the bank. Because of the habitat benefits and other reasons, uh, like redirecting flow towards the center of the channel, I'd prefer that over the sort of riprap. Uh,
Hmm.
but in essence, you are still trying to sort of freeze it in place and not allowing the river to migrate. Um, so you need to think about that migration, perhaps smaller log jams, not armoring the entire length of an outside bend, as
Hmm.
was the case in that Minnesota example. If you look in that document or study my slides more carefully after the uh, talk here.
Great, thank you. Next one is, dam removals in general able to pass sediment without mishap? I know this can be site dependent, but we often have citizens who are concerned about, quote, after effects of dam removals.
Yeah, I was scratching my head preparing for this talk, trying to think of an example where the sediment moving downstream had caused a problem. I couldn't think of one in New England. That doesn't mean it can't be a problem, won't be a problem on another project. So I would keep it at the forefront. And I think if you are studying it, thinking about where that sediment might accumulate, uh, and studying the impoundment if dam has indeed accumulated, which might not be the case in many circumstances. I think if you can provide those results beforehand to community members, hopefully those open to discussion uh, would be willing to accept and understand that it's not going to be a problem. It's a valid question they're asking and should be addressed. Sometimes the feelings are too strong to accept the results, and they might continue believing it'll be a problem. But at least you would have done your due diligence.
Hmm. All right, next question we got is, in Briggsville example, would a hydraulic model at the time of dam removal be able to predict some of the changes you noted? With Tropical Storm Irene being the flood of record, would the hydraulic model have looked at relevant design storms, or would typically engineering only look at 25, 50, and 100-year design flows?
Hindsight's 2020, so I don't disagree with that question. I don't know. I'd not even, I'd assume hydraulic modeling was done. I haven't seen hydraulic modeling results from the dam removal. I haven't been deeply involved in this yet. Uh, so those are valid questions. Um, but some things that should have been identified that weren't necessarily was the artificial fill. The bank that's eroding is composed of artificial fill. That should have been recognized and considered. I mean, it's looser material. It's going to erode more easily than natural soil. The huge landslide downstream, that should have been recognized, discussed, thought through, modeled. So some things perhaps should have been recognized. The geomorphologist is trained to recognize those things. I'm not necessarily blaming the engineers because that's not necessarily their job to focus on those things. But I think there was mention of a future talk where building a team. Couldn't
Mhm.
agree more. You need engineers, you need biologists, and you need geomorphologists involved in these dam removal projects, or you're going to miss some of these things that perhaps should have been caught before the dam was removed at Briggsville.
Mhm. I
But I'm
think
not
that,
blaming
yeah,
anybody.
yeah. I think there was some hydraulic analysis done before, but I wasn't on the project. But next question on back to Briggsville's. Can you speculate on what might have happened during Hurricane Irene if the Briggsville was intact at the time of the storm? So if the dam was in place at the time of the storm, what would have happened at Briggsville? I don't know. It's kind of a hypothetical.
It is probably largely the same thing, I suspect.
Okay.
Uh, but I'd really like the hydraulic modeling results, particularly that Route 8 washout. It's a little bit further upstream. I don't know if the sort of impoundment would have extended that far and whether flow velocities were increased by the dam removal. Anyway, that's a good idea, though. As
Yeah.
part of the hydraulic modeling that's coming up, is to run as one scenario the dam back in place. It's easy to do in the model, hard to do in real life, but that's an interesting scenario to run.
Yeah. I mean, Irene was hard, was a big storm for all of
Yeah,
us.
and that's the problem with these things. I mean, it's going to take a big storm for any of these problems to occur, so it's easy to just say, "Oh, it was a big storm," and wash our hands of it. But I think it's important to think a little bit more carefully about why did these things occur exactly where they occurred, and did
Mhm.
the dam removal have anything to do with it, or the way the dam removal was done have
Yeah.
anything to do with it?
All right. Next question we have is, uh, we have a dam removal project under design in a highly visible location at a public park. The community is interested in a quote polished look at the end of the project, and there is not a lot of space to allow for passive channel design. If we take a more active design approach, natural channel design, are there any rules of thumb aside from looking for fast changes, being aware of sediment transport, hydraulic modeling that might be helpful with this approach?
Well, again, it sounds like in that kind of scenario, there could be a temptation to like leave a piece of the dam there. Uh, it, it's a little bit like the Temple Stream example. They left that sort of remnant piece as an overlook of the dam removal. Is that going to constrict flow in any way? Again, that fast change piece is a qualitative thing. The hydraulic model can help quantify that. Um, if you're looking at various stream restoration scenarios, the word passive approach suggesting perhaps letting the river sort of find its own way type of thing. That kind of scenario requires the space, which sounds like might not be there. So at least understand your limitations and design accordingly. Don't put a passive approach, which is going to allow the channel to move around and to move right into some of these amenities the town wants. So at least understand what your constraints are. We can't always have a passive approach because there's too many constraints. So um, I don't know if that's really
Mhm.
answering the cross
Yeah,
question, but
I'd
that's what
add
I
a
have
little
on the
bit.
top of my head.
The top of my head too would say like at least with the public engagement, having images of other because I know a big concern we hear a lot is mud flats and that sort of thing. Is it going to be a salt marsh mud flat for the rest of eternity? Having images from other ones, similar projects, similar sized rivers can be very helpful for the engagement. Be like, hey, this was before and after at the project, and the sediment will come back, and the seeds will come back. That'll be a good way to engage the public because I know people are concerned about that. Very very often concerned.
Yep.
Um, we have another question. Could you outline what accurate hydraulic modeling would include? Giving your statement to be careful about what is currently available. In other words, what elements would make modeling accurate and worthwhile?
Well, more and more, I would turn towards two-dimensional hydraulic modeling, not one dimensional hydraulic modeling. It's going to give you far more accurate information on sort of flow velocities and shear stresses along the banks rather than sort of an average uh, thing which comes with a 1D model. So, especially if you're worried about sort of bank erosion around infrastructure, you're probably looking ideally at a two-dimensional model. Uh, a lot of detailed topographic information. LIDAR gives you everything above water, but you're especially in deeper impoundments, it's critical to have the bathymetric data or sort of topographic data if it's sort of downstream of a dam. Again, I'm not a hydraulic modeler, but you want sort of your endpoints of the model at good spots. Losing my voice now, but uh, so someone that's like FEMA has sort of hydraulic models for almost every river in the country, but those cross sections are so widely spaced that it's not really going to provide you accurate information to design a dam removal. Um, so be careful and sort of a well, you can adopt a past model, but you're going to want to build on it. But just taking the results from a FEMA model, which is covering several miles of river, is not really going to provide you the information you need for sort of immediately around a dam, so to speak, for example.
Yeah. The last question is about contaminated sediment behind dams, especially in urban areas. Um, can you talk a little bit about, looking at contaminated sediments and what goes into, um, I know this has been touched on other presentations, but your experience with contaminated sediments, if you have any, and what you've seen done. I don't know if you want to touch, and I can touch too on it if you want.
It's a bit outside my bailiwick. I should have mentioned in the talking about the fate of the sediment. It's not only where it's going to accumulate downstream, but you also want to analyze the sediment in the impoundment. There's going to be uh, less wiggle room in terms of allowing the sediment to be released downstream if it's full of contaminant. And so then you're looking at your natural channel design scenarios or your rock ramps or rock weirs to sort of keep that sediment in place. But I can't really speak to contaminants and analyzing that. That's not
Yeah,
really my expertise.
yeah, I would just add that a lot, when you're doing dam removal, you look at upstream impoundment, downstream, the sediment characteristics, and you would do testing in accordance to your state agency, Mass DEP, the regulators, and sometimes they, can cap it somewhere on site, off site, or they, if it's really bad, you got to take it off and remove it at a landfill. And other times they can be released. So it depends on all the studies and with the mass contingency plan. If you're in Massachusetts, all the regulations. So we definitely work with the regulators at your jurisdiction, whether it be DEP or whatever state or government you're with. Um, we're hitting time. There's one question about a 2D model. But I think we're running out of time. I don't know if you want. Yeah, what you want? We can do this real quick. What 2D model has been used on the projects you have worked on? I don't know if you want to name that or.
Okay, well, I guess HEC-RAS or the Hydrologic
Yeah.
Engineering Center has 2D model now, which I've seen seems to be used quite a bit. Uh, I mean, years ago, Flow 2D was one I remember, but again, I'm not a hydraulic modeler, so um, there's many, but that sort of HEC-RAS, if it's called HEC-RAS, the 2D model,
Mm-hmm.
um, that seems to be widely used and accepted
Great.
and available.
Yeah, I think the Army Corps, I think, does that. Um, well, thank you everybody for coming. We did hit time here at 1 o'clock, so I just want to, you know, respect everybody's time. So thank you, John, for your awesome presentation and answering
Thank
all
you.
these great questions and joining us today. Please remember to fill out the evaluation form and join us next week, next month, March 12th at noon for about building the dam removal team, which is, as John said and others have said, very critical for your projects because you know it's a big tent. We gotta these projects is all about bringing people together, getting different perspectives in the room. So thank you so much for coming today, and yeah, it was a great conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.
Thank you.